At Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law whispered, "You weren't invited. Paying the bills doesn't make you family." I took a sip of wine and calmly said, "Then I hope you can pay the $8,000 that are due tomorrow." The next morning, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is George, and I'm 59 years old. I thought I knew what family meant until Christmas Eve, when my daughter-in-law whispered words that would change everything." The dining room glowed with warm candlelight, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany table I'd bought 3 years ago. Rebecca had insisted on the expensive one from that fancy furniture store downtown. "It needs to look right for our guests," she'd said, and like always I'd written the check without question. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, mixed with the scent of pine from the 12-foot Christmas tree that dominated the living room corner. Another expense I'd covered, of course. I sat at what Rebecca called the head of the table, though it felt more like being positioned for display than honor. Michael, my son, carved the turkey with practiced precision while Rebecca fluttered around, adjusting place settings and ensuring everything met her standards of perfection. Their friends, the Hendersons, sat across from me, along with Rebecca's sister Martha and her husband. Everyone laughed and chatted, the wine flowing freely as conversation bounced from vacation plans to home renovations. "George has been so generous with helping us with the house updates," Rebecca announced to the table, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound grateful, but somehow made it feel like an obligation. "We couldn't have afforded the new kitchen without him." The table murmured appreciative sounds, but I noticed how she phrased it. Not, "My father-in-law helped us," or "George chose to help us." Just stating a fact, like mentioning the weather. I took a sip of wine, watching Michael nod along with his wife's words. When had my son stopped looking me in the eye during these conversations? When had he started treating my presence at family gatherings like something to be endured rather than enjoyed? The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself drifting, remembering how different things used to be. After my wife Sarah died 4 years ago, I'd thrown myself into supporting Michael and Rebecca. They were struggling with their mortgage. Rebecca wasn't working while pursuing her real estate license, and they had dreams of starting a family. I'd been happy to help, believing that's what fathers do, what family does. But somewhere along the way, my help had transformed from generous gestures into expected contributions. The monthly mortgage assistance became automatic. The utility bills started coming to my address. When their car broke down, they didn't ask if I could help with a loan. They asked which dealership I preferred for the financing. "Dad, could you pass the wine?" Michael's voice pulled me back to the present. I reached for the bottle, noting how he called me Dad in front of guests, but barely acknowledged me when we were alone. Rebecca was telling Martha about their plans for a summer vacation to Europe, describing hotel suites and restaurant reservations with the casual confidence of someone who'd never worried about the cost because someone else would handle it. "That sounds expensive," Martha commented with a laugh. "Oh, we'll manage," Rebecca replied with a wave of her hand. "George always makes sure we're taken care of." There it was again, that phrase that made my stomach twist. Not, "We're grateful for George's support," or "George chooses to help us." Just the assumption that I would, that I should, that it was my responsibility to ensure their comfort. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from the table. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear Rebecca's voice carrying from the dining room. "He's been so good to us," she was saying. "I don't know what we'd do without him." The words should have warmed my heart, but something in her tone made me pause. I stood in the hallway listening. "You're lucky to have him," I heard Martha reply. "Oh, we are," Rebecca continued. "Though honestly, sometimes I think he gets more out of it than we do. You know how lonely he's been since Sarah passed. Having us around gives him purpose." My chest tightened. Is that how she saw it? That I paid their bills because I was lonely and desperate for their company? I returned to the table, forcing a smile as I took my seat. The conversation had moved on, but Rebecca's words echoed in my mind. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced pleasantries and wine that tasted increasingly bitter. As the evening wound down and guests began preparing to leave, I found myself helping clear dishes, a habit from years of marriage to Sarah. Rebecca was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher with efficient movements. "Thank you for tonight," I said, genuinely meaning it despite everything. "The dinner was beautiful." She paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Of course," Though next year, maybe we should consider having it at Martha's. Her dining room is bigger. But this is our tradition, I said, confused. We've hosted Christmas here for the past 3 years. Rebecca's smile was thin, almost patronizing. George, I need to tell you something. She moved closer, lowering her voice so Michael couldn't hear from the living room where he was saying goodbye to guests. Her perfume was strong, almost overwhelming in the small kitchen space. You weren't really invited tonight, she whispered, her words hitting me like ice water. I mean, you live here, so obviously you'd be here, but this isn't your dinner party. Paying the bills doesn't make you family. I felt my world tilt sideways. The wine glass in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. What did you say? I'm not trying to be cruel, she continued in that same quiet tone, but I think you've gotten confused about your role here. You're Michael's father, and we're grateful for your support, but that doesn't mean you get to insert yourself into our social life like you're the host. The kitchen seemed to shrink around me. 4 years of believing I was building something with them, of thinking we were becoming a real family unit, and she was telling me I was just a boarder who happened to pay well. I took a slow sip of wine, my hands remarkably steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. When I looked at her, I kept my voice calm, controlled. Then I hope you can manage to pay the $8,000 that's due tomorrow on your own. Rebecca's face went pale. What $8,000? The property tax bill that came last week. It's due December 26th. I was planning to handle it tomorrow, but since I'm not really family. I shrugged, taking another sip of wine. George, I didn't mean— Oh, but you did mean it, I said quietly. You meant every word. I set my wine glass down on the counter and walked toward the living room where Michael was still chatting with the departing guests. Rebecca followed behind me, her footsteps quick and nervous. As I watched my son laugh with his friends, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I'd been so desperate to maintain a connection with him after Sarah's death that I'd allowed myself to become a convenience rather than a father. I'd confused being needed with being loved. The guests finally left, and Michael turned to me with that polite smile he'd perfected. Thanks for dinner, Dad. Rebecca outdid herself. I nodded, studying his face. When had my son learned to look at me the way you'd look at a helpful stranger? When had warmth been replaced by obligation? Michael, I said, do you know when the property taxes are due? He frowned. Property taxes? I don't know. Rebecca handles all that stuff with you. What about the mortgage payment or the utility bills? His confusion deepened. Dad, you know I don't deal with any of that. You and Rebecca work all that out. And there it was. My son had no idea how much I contributed to their life because he'd never had to think about it. To him, I was just a presence in the background, making sure everything worked smoothly while he lived his life. I went to bed that night with Rebecca's words echoing in my mind. Paying the bills doesn't make you family. She was right, of course. But what she didn't understand was that I'd learned something far more valuable than she'd intended to teach me. If paying the bills didn't make me family, then maybe it was time to stop paying them. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom they'd given me in their house, the house whose mortgage I'd been covering for 3 years, I thought about the conversation I'd had with my attorney last month, the one about protecting my assets, the one about what would happen to all these arrangements if something happened to me. Rebecca thought she'd put me in my place with her whispered cruelty. What she didn't know was that she'd just given me the clarity I'd been lacking for years. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting. I woke up at 6:30 on Christmas morning to the sound of Rebecca's phone ringing in the kitchen below. Then it rang again and again. By the 4th call, I could hear her voice, sharp with irritation, answering. I'd slept better than I had in months. For the first time in years, I felt completely clear about where I stood. Rebecca's words had cut deep, but they'd also cut clean, severing whatever illusions I'd been clinging to about our relationship. I made my coffee in the quiet of my room, using the small machine I'd bought after too many mornings of going downstairs to find they'd forgotten to make enough for me. Through my window, I could see the neighbor's house already alive with Christmas morning excitement, kids running around in their pajamas. I remembered when Michael was that age, how Sarah and I would stay up half the night assembling toys and setting up elaborate surprises. Another phone call echoed from downstairs, this one longer. Rebecca's voice carried up through the vents, though I couldn't make out the words. There was an edge to it now, something that hadn't been there last night when she was so confident about putting me in my place. I dressed slowly, taking my time with each button and fold. There was no rush anymore. No urgency to be downstairs early to help with breakfast or to show enthusiasm for gift exchanges with people who saw me as an inconvenience. When I finally went downstairs, I found Rebecca pacing in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She was still in her robe, her hair uncombed, and there was a stack of opened mail on the counter that definitely hadn't been there last night. "I don't understand," she was saying into the phone. "There has to be some mistake. The payment was supposed to be automatic." She saw me enter the kitchen and held up one finger as if I were interrupting something important. I poured myself coffee from the pot she'd made, noting that she'd only made enough for 2 cups. Old habits. "Can you hold, please?" she said into the phone, then covered the mouthpiece with her hand. "George, there's some confusion with the mortgage company. They're saying the December payment was never made." I took a sip of coffee. "Was it supposed to be?" Her eyes narrowed. "Of course it was supposed to be. You always handle the mortgage on the 15th, do I?" I asked. "I don't recall agreeing to handle December's payment." She stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. "George, you've been paying our mortgage for 3 years." "That's true," I nodded. "But last night you made it very clear that paying bills doesn't make me family. So I thought perhaps the family should start handling their own bills." The color drained from her face. She fumbled with the phone, speaking quickly to whoever was on the other end. "I'll have to call you back," she said, then hung up. "George, about last night. What about it?" I asked calmly. "You were very clear about boundaries. I'm simply respecting them." Michael appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension in Rebecca's voice. He was wearing the expensive pajamas I'd given him last Christmas, though he probably didn't remember where they'd come from. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between us. "There's been a misunderstanding with the bills," Rebecca said quickly. "Some kind of mix-up." "What kind of mix-up?" Michael asked, but he was looking at me now, and I could see the first flicker of awareness in his eyes. "Your wife explained to me last night that I shouldn't confuse my role here," I said. "She's right. I've been overstepping." Rebecca's phone rang again, then again. Each ring seemed louder in the increasingly tense kitchen. "Dad," Michael said slowly, "what exactly is going on?" Before I could answer, Rebecca's phone rang once more. This time she answered it immediately, her voice strained. "Henderson Property Management, yes, this is Rebecca Morris. What do you mean the payment was declined?" She shot a panicked look at Michael. "That's impossible. Let me check and call you back." She hung up and immediately started dialing another number. "This is insane," she muttered. "The property tax people are saying the same thing, like everything just stopped processing at once." I refilled my coffee cup, noting how quiet the house had become except for Rebecca's increasingly frantic phone calls. No Christmas music playing, no excitement about presents, no warmth of holiday morning. Just the cold reality of what their life actually cost. "The electric company too?" Rebecca was saying into the phone. "But that can't be right. The payment was set up to go through automatically on the 23rd. Michael was fully awake now, the situation beginning to penetrate his usual morning fog. "Rebecca, what's happening with all these bills?" She covered the phone again. "I don't know. Everything is coming back declined. The utility companies, the mortgage, the property taxes, even the gardening service." "How is that possible?" Michael asked. I set my coffee cup down carefully. "It's possible because I closed the account that all those automatic payments were coming from." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's phone slipped slightly in her hand. Michael's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You what?" Rebecca whispered. "I closed the account," I repeated calmly. "Yesterday morning, actually, right after I spoke with my attorney about asset protection. Funny thing about automatic payments, they only work when there's money in the account to pay them." Michael sank into one of the kitchen chairs. "Dad, I don't understand. Why would you do that?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who genuinely couldn't understand why I might stop paying for his lifestyle after being told I wasn't really family. "Because, Michael, your wife made it very clear last night that I needed to understand my place. And my place, apparently, is not as family, so I thought the actual family should start handling family responsibilities." Rebecca's phone started ringing again. She stared at it like it was a snake. "How much do we owe?" Michael asked quietly. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been tracking everything for months. My attorney had suggested I document all expenses, and I'd been meticulous. Well, let's see. There's the mortgage payment that was due yesterday, $2,800. The property taxes due today, $8,000. The electric bill, $467. Water and sewer, $212. Internet and cable, $190. The gardening service, $300. And the homeowner's insurance that's due next week, $1,500. With each number, Michael's face grew paler. He started calculating in his head. $13,169, I finished. Due immediately. And that's just this month's bills. It doesn't include the credit card payments I've been making, or the car insurance, or the grocery money I transfer every week. Rebecca finally answered her phone, but I could tell from her voice that she was barely holding it together. Yes, I understand the payment was declined. Can you give me until tomorrow to resolve this? Michael was staring at the stack of mail on the counter with new eyes. Dad, I had no idea it was so much. Of course you didn't, I said. Because you never had to think about it. Neither of you did. You just lived your lives, made your plans, bought your things, and trusted that Dad would handle the boring financial stuff. But we're grateful, Michael started. Are you? I asked. Because last night your wife told me that I was confused about my role here. That paying bills doesn't make me family. She's absolutely right. Rebecca ended her call and turned to face us, her composure finally cracking. George, please. I was upset last night. I didn't mean what I said. You meant every word, I replied. And more importantly, you were right. I've been confused about my role. I thought I was helping family, but I was really just enabling two adults to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. Michael's phone started ringing now. He looked at it with growing dread. That's probably your credit card company, I said. The payment for that was due yesterday, too, along with Rebecca's card, and the line of credit you took out last year for the kitchen renovation. How much is all of that? Michael asked weakly. About $4,000 in minimum payments. Though if you want to actually pay down the balances instead of just covering interest, it would be closer to $8,000. Rebecca was now frantically scrolling through her phone, probably trying to figure out how much money they actually had in their own accounts. From the look on her face, I could guess the answer. We have to fix this, she said, but she was talking more to herself than to us. Michael looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child who'd broken something valuable and was hoping his father could fix it. Dad, he said quietly, what do we do? For a moment I felt the old instinct to step in, to solve their problems, to make everything okay. But then I remembered Rebecca's words from last night, and I remembered the years of being taken for granted, of being treated like a convenient service rather than a person. You figure it out, I said simply. You're adults. You have jobs. You have credit. You have options. You just never had to use them before. I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and placed it in the dishwasher. Both of them watched me like I was performing some incomprehensible ritual. I'm going out for a while, I announced. I have some errands to run. As I walked toward the door, I could hear Rebecca's phone ringing again, and Michael asking her how much money they had in their checking account. Her answer was a whisper I couldn't quite catch, but Michael's sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. I had given them exactly what they'd asked for, clarity about roles and responsibilities. Now they could discover what their lives actually cost when someone else wasn't quietly covering the bills. The morning air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in years I felt like I could breathe freely. I had important calls to make, starting with my attorney, because this was just the beginning. I drove to my attorney's office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. David Brennan had been my lawyer for over a decade, handling everything from my business affairs when I was still working to Sarah's estate after she passed. He was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation, and more importantly, he was the one who'd been warning me for months about what he called financial exploitation by family members. David's office was closed for Christmas, but he'd agreed to meet me after I'd called him earlier that morning. He was waiting in the lobby when I arrived, dressed casually but alert. George, he said, shaking my hand. You sounded different on the phone, more focused. I am focused, I replied. For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly. We settled into his office, and I told him about the previous night's conversation with Rebecca, about her whispered cruelty and the clarity it had given me. David listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if he'd been expecting this conversation for months. "George," he said when I finished, "I'm going to share something with you that I probably should have told you sooner, but you weren't ready to hear it." He opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder with my name on it. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. Photographs, printed emails, even what looked like transcripts. "What is this?" I asked. 3 months ago, you mentioned that Rebecca had been asking a lot of questions about your will, about your assets, about what would happen if you became incapacitated. That concerned me, so I hired a private investigator. My stomach dropped. "You did what?" "I've seen this pattern before, George. Adult children or their spouses who gradually take control of an elderly parent's finances, often with the best of intentions initially, but it can evolve into something much more sinister." He spread several photographs across his desk. They showed Rebecca meeting with a man I didn't recognize in what looked like a law office. "This is attorney Marcus Webb. He specializes in elder law, specifically guardianship and conservatorship cases. Rebecca has met with him 4 times in the past 2 months. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "Guardianship?" David nodded grimly. "She's been building a case that you're experiencing cognitive decline. She's documented instances where you've supposedly been confused about finances, made poor decisions, shown signs of memory loss." He handed me a printed email. It was from Rebecca to someone named Dr. Patricia Mills, dated just 6 weeks ago. As I read it, my hands began to shake. "Dr. Mills, thank you for agreeing to evaluate my father-in-law's mental state. As I mentioned on the phone, we're concerned about his ability to manage his finances safely. He's been making increasingly erratic decisions, forgetting to pay important bills, and yesterday he couldn't remember our address when filling out a form. We love him dearly, but we're worried he might hurt himself or others if his condition continues to deteriorate. Please let me know what documentation you'll need to proceed with a competency evaluation." I set the email down with trembling fingers. This is all lies. I know that, and you know that. But Dr. Mills doesn't know that, and neither would a judge if Rebecca had proceeded with her plan. What plan exactly? David pulled out another document, a draft petition for guardianship. It was dated just 2 weeks ago, though it had never been filed. "She was preparing to have you declared mentally incompetent. Once that happened, she and Michael would have become your legal guardians, with complete control over your finances, your medical decisions, even where you could live." The words on the page blurred as the full scope of what Rebecca had been planning hit me. This wasn't just about taking advantage of my generosity. This was about taking control of my entire life. "The nursing home brochures," I said suddenly, remembering something I'd found in Rebecca's purse a month ago when she'd asked me to get her medication. "What nursing home brochures?" I found them in her purse. Brochures for expensive care facilities. When I asked her about them, she said she was just being prepared, thinking ahead in case something happened to me. David's expression darkened. "George, those facilities cost upwards of $8,000 a month. If she had you declared incompetent and institutionalized, she'd have complete access to your assets to pay for your care while maintaining control over everything else." I thought about all the times Rebecca had suggested I was forgetting things, all the moments she'd gently corrected me about conversations I supposedly couldn't remember, all the instances where she'd taken over tasks I'd been handling perfectly well. "She's been gaslighting me," I said quietly. "Systematically," David confirmed. "Look at this." He showed me transcripts of phone calls that Rebecca had apparently been recording. Conversations where she would ask me complex questions about finances when I was tired or distracted, then document my responses as evidence of confusion. "How did you get these?" Rebecca made a mistake. She stored everything in cloud accounts that she accessed from her laptop. When she brought her computer to a repair shop for a virus issue, the technician was legally required to report suspicious activity. Financial exploitation of elderly individuals is something they're trained to recognize. The room was spinning. For months, I'd been living with someone who was systematically documenting everything I said and did, building a case to have me declared incompetent so she could steal everything I'd worked for. "There's more," David said gently. "We found communications between Rebecca and Michael where they discussed the timeline for implementing their plan." He handed me printed text messages between my son and his wife. Reading them felt like swallowing glass. "Rebecca, Dad seems more confused lately. Maybe it's time to move forward with Dr. Mills." "Michael, Are you sure? He seemed fine at dinner last week. Rebecca. Trust me, I live with him every day. Yesterday he put salt in his coffee instead of sugar and didn't even notice. Michael. If you think it's necessary, you know him better than I do now. Rebecca. It's for his own protection, honey. He's going to hurt himself if we don't step in soon. I had never put salt in my coffee. That incident never happened. But here was my son, accepting his wife's lies about me without question, agreeing to a plan that would strip me of my autonomy and dignity. Michael knew, I said, the words coming out like a groan. I'm sorry, George. The messages suggest he was initially reluctant, but Rebecca convinced him it was necessary. I thought about my son's behavior over the past few months, how he'd started talking to me like I was fragile, how he'd begun making decisions for me about things I'd always handled myself, how he'd stopped including me in conversations about important matters because Rebecca had told him I wouldn't understand. How close were they to filing? I asked. Very close. Based on the timeline in their communications, they were planning to move forward right after the holidays. The Christmas dinner last night was probably going to be one of their last documentation opportunities before filing the petition. The irony wasn't lost on me. Rebecca's cruelty last night, her need to put me in my place, had actually saved me from something far worse than financial exploitation. She'd been planning to steal my entire life. What are my options? I asked. David smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Well, now that you know what they were planning, you have several advantages. First, none of their documentation will hold up to scrutiny because it's all fabricated. Second, you can protect your assets in ways that would make their plan impossible, even if they tried to proceed. He pulled out another set of documents. I've been preparing for this conversation for weeks. We can immediately transfer your assets into an irrevocable trust that would protect them from any guardianship claims. We can also document their fraud attempt, which would make it very difficult for them to convince any court that they were acting in your best interests. What about the house? I asked. They live in that house. I've been paying the mortgage for 3 years. Whose name is on the deed? Mine. I put the down payment up and my name is on everything. They just live there and I pay the bills. David's smile grew wider. Then you have more power than they realize. George, you're not the victim they thought you were setting up. You're about to become their worst nightmare. As I signed documents transferring my assets into protected accounts, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Control. For months I'd been living in a house where people were documenting my every move, planning to steal my life from me, treating me like an inconvenience while they plotted my downfall. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was as helpless and confused as they were pretending I was. They had no idea that I'd been quietly protecting myself, that I had resources and allies they knew nothing about. David, I said as we finished the paperwork, I want to know everything. Every meeting Rebecca had, every lie she told, every document she forged. I want a complete record of what they were planning to do to me. Already prepared, he said, handing me a flash drive. Everything is documented and legally obtained. If they try to proceed with any guardianship claims, this evidence will destroy their credibility completely. As I drove home, I thought about the conversation I'd have with Michael and Rebecca that evening. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who'd temporarily stopped paying their bills out of spite. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who knew exactly what they'd been planning, someone who had spent months quietly preparing for this moment. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway. It was still the same building, but I no longer saw it as home. I saw it as a place where people had been plotting against me, documenting my supposed decline, preparing to steal my freedom. But I also saw it as the place where I would finally take back control of my life. As I walked through the front door, I could hear Rebecca on the phone in the kitchen, her voice strained as she tried to negotiate payment extensions with various creditors. Michael was pacing in the living room, running his hands through his hair. They looked up when I entered, hope flickering in their eyes. They thought I was coming home to fix their problems, to restore their comfortable lifestyle, to go back to being the convenient ATM I'd been for years. They were about to discover how wrong they were. When I walked through the front door, the desperation in the house was palpable. Rebecca was still on the phone, but her voice had taken on a pleading quality that I'd never heard before. Michael looked up from the pile of bills spread across the coffee table, his face drawn with stress. "Dad, thank God you're back," he said, standing up quickly. "We need to talk." I set my keys down calmly, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed different now. Everything in this house looked different when you knew the truth about the people living in it. Of course, I said. We definitely need to talk. Rebecca ended her call and hurried over, her usual composure completely gone. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and there was a frantic energy about her that I'd never seen before. George, I'm so sorry about last night, she said rapidly. I was tired. I'd had too much wine. I said things I didn't mean. You know how much we appreciate everything you do for us. I looked at her carefully, remembering all the times she'd made similar apologies after saying something cruel, always blaming external factors, stress, exhaustion, hormones, never taking real responsibility for her words or actions. Actually, Rebecca, I think you meant exactly what you said, and I think it was exactly what I needed to hear. Michael stepped closer. Dad, whatever happened last night, we can work it out. But right now, we have a crisis. The mortgage company called again, and they're talking about acceleration of the loan. The property tax people are threatening to put a lien on the house. We need to get these payments caught up immediately. I sat down in my usual chair, the one I'd been occupying for 3 years while unknowingly being studied and documented like a laboratory specimen. Michael, do you know what guardianship is? He frowned. Guardianship? Like for kids? No, for adults who are declared mentally incompetent. When someone petitions the court to take legal control of another person's life because they're supposedly unable to make decisions for themselves. Rebecca had gone very still. I could see her face from the corner of my eye, but I kept my attention on Michael. I don't understand, Michael said. Why are you asking about that? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out one of the documents David had given me. It was the draft guardianship petition with Rebecca's name on it as the proposed guardian. Because your wife has been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could gain legal control of my assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael took the document with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the legal language. I watched his face change as he read, confusion giving way to shock, then to something approaching horror. Rebecca, he said quietly, what is this? She was backing toward the kitchen, her face pale. Michael, I can explain. Can you? I asked, standing up. Can you explain these? I pulled out the printed emails, the text messages between them, the photographs of her meetings with Attorney Webb. I spread them across the coffee table like playing cards. Can you explain why you've been meeting with lawyers about having me declared incompetent? Can you explain these emails to doctors about my supposed cognitive decline? Can you explain these text messages where you tell my son that I'm confused and dangerous? Michael was reading through the messages, his face growing paler with each page. Rebecca, these texts. You said Dad put salt in his coffee. That never happened. You weren't there, Rebecca said weakly. You don't see him every day like I do. I live here too, Michael shot back. I've never seen Dad confused about anything. I walked over to the kitchen counter where Rebecca kept her laptop. Would you like to see the nursing home brochures she's been collecting? The ones for facilities that cost $8,000 a month? Or perhaps the recorded phone calls where she documented my responses to trick questions designed to make me sound confused? Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand, she said, her voice rising. We were trying to protect you. You're getting older. You might need help someday. Protect me from what? I asked calmly. From my own money? From my own decisions? From my own life? Michael was still staring at the documents. Rebecca, this says you were planning to file this petition next week, right after Christmas. We were going to discuss it with you first, she said desperately. No, I said firmly. You were going to blindside me with it. You were going to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized so you could control my assets. The only discussion would have been which nursing home to warehouse me in while you spent my money. Michael set the papers down with shaking hands. I never agreed to anything like this. Actually, you did, I said, pointing to the text messages. Right here. Rebecca tells you she thinks it's time to move forward with the guardianship, and you say, if you think it's necessary, you know him better than I do now. I thought she meant getting you some help around the house, maybe a cleaning service or something. I didn't know she meant having you declared mentally incompetent. Rebecca was crying now, but they were tears of frustration rather than remorse. You're both overreacting. Lots of families have to make these kinds of decisions when parents get older. Parents who are actually experiencing cognitive decline, I said, not parents who are perfectly competent but inconveniently independent. I walked back to my chair and sat down, feeling remarkably calm despite the chaos unfolding around me. Here's what's going to happen. Rebecca, you're going to call Attorney Webb and tell him you're withdrawing any and all plans for guardianship proceedings. You're going to call Dr. Mills and cancel any evaluations you've scheduled. And you're going to provide me with copies of every document, every recording, every piece of evidence you've collected in your campaign to have me declared incompetent. And if I don't? She asked, defiance creeping into her voice. Then I'll file criminal charges for attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, fraud, and conspiracy. I'll also sue you civilly for damages, and I'll make sure every detail of your plan becomes part of the public record. Michael was staring at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. Rebecca, how could you do this? He's my father. I was thinking about our future, she snapped. Your father has more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes, and we're struggling to make ends meet. I was trying to secure our financial stability. By stealing from him, Michael said quietly. By managing resources that he's going to leave to you anyway, she shot back. What's the difference if we have access to them now when we actually need them? The mask was completely off now. No more pretense about concern for my well-being, no more claims about protecting me from myself. It was pure greed, rationalized as entitlement. The difference, I said, is that they're my resources to manage, and after what I've learned today, I'm not sure you're going to inherit anything at all. Rebecca's eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean that my will is going to require some significant revisions. People who try to steal from me while I'm alive probably shouldn't expect to inherit from me when I'm dead. Michael stood up abruptly. Dad, I swear I didn't know what she was really planning. I thought she just wanted to help you with financial management. Maybe set up some systems to make things easier. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of deception. I wanted to believe him, wanted to think that my own child hadn't been actively plotting to destroy my autonomy. But the text messages were clear. He'd agreed to Rebecca's plan, even if he claimed not to understand its full scope. Michael, I said carefully, 3 months ago, Rebecca asked you about my will, about what would happen to my assets if I became incapacitated. Do you remember that conversation? He nodded reluctantly. What did you tell her? I said I didn't know the details, that you'd never discussed it with me. She said that was a problem, that we needed to understand the financial situation in case something happened to you. And then what? She said she was going to research our options, make sure we were prepared for any eventuality. Did you think that research might include trying to have me declared mentally incompetent? Michael was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. I didn't think that far ahead. I trusted her to handle it appropriately. You trusted her to handle stealing from me appropriately. That's not fair, Dad. I never thought of it as stealing. What did you think of it as? I thought of it as family taking care of family. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Family taking care of family. Is that what you call plotting to have me institutionalized so you could control my money? The room fell silent except for Rebecca's quiet crying. She was sitting on the couch now, her face in her hands, the weight of her exposed scheme finally settling on her. Here's what's going to happen, I said, standing up. Rebecca, you have 24 hours to provide me with every document, every recording, every piece of evidence you've collected. You're going to call Attorney Webb and formally withdraw from any guardianship proceedings, and you're going to sign a statement acknowledging that you fabricated evidence about my mental state. And if I do all that, she asked, then I won't file criminal charges, but you're going to move out of this house immediately. Michael's head snapped up. Dad, you can't kick us out. We don't have anywhere to go. You should have thought of that before you agreed to have me declared mentally incompetent, but I didn't really understand. Michael, I said firmly, you're 34 years old. You have a college degree and a job. You've been living in my house, driving cars I pay for, using credit cards I pay off, eating food I buy. You've been completely supported by me for 3 years, and your response was to agree when your wife suggested I was mentally declining and needed to be controlled. We can work this out, he said desperately. We can go to counseling. We can rebuild trust. Trust? I asked. Son, you were planning to have me locked away in a nursing home. You were going to sit in court and swear that I was mentally incompetent. You were going to visit me on weekends in some facility while you lived in my house and spent my money. What part of that suggests we can rebuild trust? Rebecca looked up from her hands. George, please. We made mistakes, but we can fix this. We're family. I thought about her words from the night before. Paying the bills doesn't make you family. She was right then. And she was right now, just not in the way she'd intended. No, Rebecca, I said quietly. Family doesn't plot to steal from each other. Family doesn't fabricate evidence of mental illness. Family doesn't plan to warehouse their loved ones in institutions for financial gain. You're not my family. You're strangers who happen to live in my house. I walked toward the stairs, then paused and turned back. You have until tomorrow evening to be out. Take your personal belongings, but leave everything I paid for. The furniture, the electronics, the clothes I bought, the jewelry, the cars, all of it stays here. Dad? Michael called after me. Where are we supposed to go? I looked at him one last time. This man who'd grown from the little boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle into someone who could agree to have me declared mentally incompetent for financial gain. I suggest you figure that out the same way you were planning to figure out how to manage my assets after you stole them from me. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I could hear them talking in urgent whispers below. Planning, probably. Strategizing their next move. But their game was over, and for the first time in years, I held all the cards. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I would sleep peacefully in my own bed, in my own house, protected by trusts they couldn't touch and armed with evidence of their betrayal. The prey had become the predator, and they didn't even realize it yet. I woke up the next morning to the sound of frantic whispering coming from downstairs. Through my bedroom door, I could hear Rebecca's voice, sharp with desperation, and Michael's deeper tones responding in what sounded like argument rather than conversation. I took my time getting dressed, making my coffee, and reviewing the documents David had given me. There was no rush anymore. I held all the power now, and they were finally beginning to understand that. When I came downstairs, I found them sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, laptops, and Rebecca's phone. They looked like they hadn't slept, which was probably accurate. The reality of their situation was likely keeping them awake. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, pouring myself coffee from the pot they'd made. For once, there was enough for 3 cups. They both looked up at me with expressions I'd never seen before. Fear mixed with resentment, desperation tempered by anger. Rebecca's eyes were red and swollen, but I could see the calculation behind the tears. She was still looking for an angle, still trying to find a way to manipulate the situation to her advantage. "Dad," Michael said carefully, "we've been talking all night. We think there might be some misunderstandings that we can clear up." I sat down across from them, noting the careful way Michael had phrased his words. Not, "We made terrible mistakes," or, "We're sorry for trying to steal your life." Just misunderstandings that could be cleared up. "I'm listening," I said. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice taking on that soft, concerned tone she'd perfected over the years. "George, I think you've misinterpreted some of my actions. When I researched guardianship options, it was just preliminary information gathering. I wanted to understand what resources might be available if you ever needed help in the future." "Preliminary information gathering," I repeated. "Is that what you call meeting with Attorney Webb 4 times and having him draft a guardianship petition?" Her composure slipped slightly. Those meetings were just consultations. I wanted to understand the process, not necessarily implement it. And the fake emails to Dr. Mills about my supposed cognitive decline. The recorded phone calls where you documented my responses to trick questions. The nursing home brochures. All just preliminary information gathering. Michael shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, maybe Rebecca went too far with the research, but her intentions were good. She was just trying to be prepared." I looked at my son, amazed at his ability to rationalize his wife's behavior even when confronted with documented evidence of her deception. "Michael, your wife fabricated evidence that I was mentally incompetent. She recorded our conversations without my knowledge. She met with lawyers about having me declared incapable of managing my own life. In what universe are those good intentions?" "She was scared," he said defensively. "She was worried about what would happen to all of us if something happened to you." "All of us," I repeated. "You mean what would happen to your comfortable lifestyle if I stopped funding it?" Rebecca's mask slipped further. "George, you're being deliberately cruel. We've built a life together, the 3 of us. We're a family. Families make plans for the future together. Families don't plot to have each other declared mentally incompetent," I said firmly. "Families don't fabricate evidence of cognitive decline. Families don't research nursing homes while planning to steal their loved ones' assets." "We weren't stealing anything," Michael said hotly. "We were talking about managing resources that you're going to leave to me anyway." "Were you?" I asked. "Because I don't recall ever telling you what's in my will. I don't recall ever promising you my assets. I don't recall ever agreeing to leave you anything at all." The silence that followed was telling. They had simply assumed they would inherit my wealth, had built their entire plan around that assumption, had justified their actions by treating my assets as if they already belonged to them. "You're my son," Michael said finally. "Of course you're going to leave everything to me." "Am I?" "Because sons who agree to have their fathers declared mentally incompetent don't typically receive generous inheritances." Rebecca's phone rang, interrupting the tension. She glanced at it, then at me, then answered with a shaky voice. "Hello? Yes, this is Rebecca Morris. What do you mean the foreclosure process has started?" "That's impossible. We just need a few more days." Her voice trailed off as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Can you hold, please?" She covered the phone with her hand and looked at me with desperate eyes. "George, the mortgage company is starting foreclosure proceedings. They say because we missed December's payment and haven't caught up the arrears, they're accelerating the entire loan. The full balance is due in 30 days, or they take the house." I took a sip of my coffee. "That seems like a problem for the people whose names are on the mortgage." "Your name is on the mortgage too," Michael said quickly. "Actually, it's not," I replied calmly. "My name is on the deed because I put down the initial payment and qualified for the loan, but the mortgage itself is in your names. I've been making the payments as a gift, but I'm not legally obligated to continue." Rebecca's face went white. "But if we lose the house, you lose your investment." "Do I?" "The deed is in my name, which means I own the house. If you default on the mortgage, the bank will foreclose. But I can pay off the loan myself, and you'll still lose the right to live here. Either way, you're moving out." Michael stood up abruptly. "Dad, you can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go?" "I've been thinking about that," I said. "Rebecca's sister Martha seemed very impressed with your lifestyle at dinner the other night. Perhaps she'd be willing to help you maintain it." "Martha doesn't have any money," Rebecca said bitterly. "Then maybe you'll need to learn to live within your actual means instead of mine." The phone in Rebecca's hand started ringing again. Then Michael's phone. Then the house phone. The financial avalanche I'd triggered by stopping my payments was gaining momentum, and they were finally beginning to understand the scope of their dependency on me. "George, please," Rebecca said, abandoning her phone to focus on me entirely. "I know I made mistakes. I know I handled things badly, but we can fix this. We can rebuild trust. We can be a real family." "We were never a real family, Rebecca. We were a convenience arrangement. I paid for your lifestyle, and you tolerated my presence. The only difference now is that I'm no longer willing to pay for the privilege of being manipulated and deceived." Michael was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. "Dad, even if you're angry with Rebecca, I'm still your son. You can't punish me for her mistakes." "Your mistakes," I corrected. "The text messages show that you agreed to her plan. You may not have understood all the details, but you agreed to have me evaluated for competency. You agreed to the guardianship proceedings. Those were your choices, Michael." I trusted my wife to make good decisions about family matters. And I trusted my son to protect me from people who wanted to harm me. We were both disappointed. Rebecca suddenly straightened up, her expression hardening. "Fine. If that's how you want to play this, George, we'll fight you. We'll tell everyone about your erratic behavior, your increasing confusion, your inability to manage your finances safely. We'll get doctors to testify that you need supervision." I smiled at her, feeling remarkably calm despite her threats. "Go ahead, Rebecca. Please do that." She blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "Contact Dr. Mills. Schedule that competency evaluation. File the guardianship petition. Please, I encourage you to do exactly that." "Why?" she asked suspiciously. "Because when you do, I'll be able to present evidence that you fabricated the documentation supporting your claims. I'll be able to show the court the emails where you invented incidents that never happened, the recordings where you tried to trap me into seeming confused, the systematic campaign you waged to build a false case against me." I stood up and walked to my briefcase, pulling out a thick folder. "David has documented everything, Rebecca. Every lie you told, every meeting you had, every piece of fraudulent evidence you created. If you try to proceed with guardianship proceedings, I'll destroy you in court and then file criminal charges for fraud and elder abuse." Her face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally hit her. She had been so focused on her plan to control me that she'd never considered the possibility that I might be aware of it, might be documenting it, might be prepared to fight back. "But we need help," she whispered. "We don't know how to manage without you." "Then you should have thought of that before you decided I was mentally incompetent." Michael's phone rang again. This time he answered it, his voice strained. "Hello? Yes, this is Michael Morris. What do you mean the credit cards are all maxed out? That's impossible. He listened for a moment, his face growing paler. Can you tell me what the last charges were? He hung up and stared at his phone. Dad, something's wrong with our credit cards. They're saying we're over our limits. Are you? I asked. We never even use them. You pay them off every month before we accumulate any real balance. I used to pay them off, I corrected, but I stopped all automatic payments 2 days ago. If you've been using the card since then, the balances have been accumulating, plus interest and fees. Rebecca was scrolling frantically through her phone. George, we have $17,000 in credit card debt. How is that possible? You've been living beyond your means for years, I said simply. I just made it invisible by paying your bills every month. The debt was always there, you just never had to face it because I handled it for you. The sound of their phones ringing became constant background noise. Creditors, utilities, service providers, everyone who had been expecting automatic payments from my accounts was now calling to demand payment. We need to make a plan, Michael said desperately. We need to figure out how to handle all this. We? I asked. Michael, I'm not part of your financial planning anymore. You and Rebecca made it very clear that you don't consider me family, that you view me as someone to be managed and controlled. Family members help each other. You're no longer family. I walked toward the stairs, then paused. You have until 6 o'clock tonight to be out of the house. I've arranged for a moving truck to be here at 7 to collect anything I paid for that you might accidentally take with you. Dad, please, Michael called after me. Don't do this. We can work it out. I turned back one last time. You were planning to warehouse me in a nursing home while you lived in my house and spent my money. You were going to visit me on weekends and pretend to care while you enjoyed the wealth you'd stolen from me. You were going to let me die alone in an institution while you built a life on the foundation of my destroyed autonomy. The weight of their betrayal hung heavy in the air between us. I'm giving you something you never planned to give me, I continued. I'm giving you a chance to build your own life, with your own resources, based on your own efforts. It's more generosity than you deserve. As I climbed the stairs, I could hear Rebecca sobbing and Michael's voice trying to calm her. But there was a frantic edge to their conversation now, the sound of people who were finally understanding that their comfortable life had been built on sand, and the tide was coming in. I had spent 3 years supporting them, and they had spent months planning to steal my freedom. Now they would learn what it meant to live without either my support or my freedom to take. By 5:30 that evening, I was sitting in my bedroom, watching through the window as Michael and Rebecca loaded their personal belongings into a rental truck. The scene below looked chaotic, boxes hastily packed, arguments about what they could and couldn't take. Rebecca crying intermittently while Michael tried to organize their hasty departure. I had spent the afternoon making phone calls to ensure a smooth transition. David had prepared all the necessary documentation to legally remove them from the property. The utility companies had been notified that the account holders were changing. I had even arranged for the locks to be changed the following morning. But the most important call had been to my financial advisor, confirming that all my assets were now safely protected in irrevocable trusts that would prevent any future guardianship claims. Rebecca and Michael could plot all they wanted. They would never again have access to my money or the ability to control my life. A knock at my bedroom door interrupted my thoughts. Michael stood in the doorway, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. Dad, we're almost finished loading. Can we talk for a minute? I gestured to the chair across from my bed. He sat down heavily, looking older than his 34 years. I know you don't believe me, he said quietly, but I really didn't understand what Rebecca was planning. When she talked about guardianship, I thought she meant something like power of attorney, just helping you manage things if you wanted help. Michael, I said gently, the text messages show that you agreed to proceed with having me declared mentally incompetent. Even if you didn't understand all the details, you agreed to that specific plan. He was quiet for a long moment. I trusted her. When she said you were having problems, I believed her because I wanted to help you. I didn't think she would lie about something like that. But you never asked me about these supposed problems. You never talked to me directly about your concerns. You just accepted her version of events and agreed to take action based on her lies. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. I should have talked to you. I should have questioned what she was telling me. I should have protected you instead of trusting someone who was manipulating both of us. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of sincerity. There was pain there, and what seemed like genuine regret, But there was also the self-serving quality of someone who had been caught and was trying to minimize the consequences. Michael, for the past 3 years, I've supported you financially while you treated me like a convenient service provider rather than your father. You've lived in my house, driven cars I paid for, used credit cards I paid off, and never once asked how I was doing or what I needed. Even without Rebecca's guardianship scheme, our relationship had already deteriorated into a financial transaction. I didn't realize, he said. I thought you wanted to help us. I thought it made you happy to be able to support us. I did want to help you. It did make me happy initially, but somewhere along the way, my help became an expectation, my generosity became an obligation, and my presence became an inconvenience. I became useful rather than loved. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I do love you, Dad. I know I haven't shown it well, but I do. Love requires more than words, Michael. It requires consideration, respect, protection. You were willing to have me declared mentally incompetent based on your wife's lies. That's not love. I know, he said again. I know I failed you. But does it have to end this way? Can't we find some way to rebuild what we had? I looked at this man who had grown from the little boy I'd taught to throw a baseball, and I felt a complex mixture of love, disappointment, and profound sadness. What we had, Michael, was based on my financial support and your willingness to accept it. That's not a relationship worth rebuilding. But we could build something different, he said desperately. Something based on actual family connection rather than money. Could we? Because right now you're sitting here asking me to forgive you not because you miss having a father, but because you need somewhere to live and someone to pay your bills. The truth of that statement hung between us like a weight. Michael opened his mouth to deny it, then closed it again, perhaps realizing that his desperation was indeed primarily financial rather than emotional. If you really want to rebuild a relationship with me, I continued, you'll do it from a distance, over time, by proving that you can value me as a person rather than as a resource. You'll get your own place, manage your own finances, build your own life, and then maybe someday we can explore whether there's still a father and son underneath all this damage. Michael nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. I understand. I don't like it, but I understand. Good. Because understanding is the first step toward actually changing. He stood up, then paused at the door. Dad, for what it's worth, I am sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for how we treated you. You deserved better from us. Yes, I said simply. I did. After he left, I heard the front door close one final time, followed by the sound of the truck starting up. I watched from my window as they drove away, carrying their hastily packed belongings toward an uncertain future. But instead of sadness, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The house was quiet now, truly quiet for the first time since Michael and Rebecca had moved in. No hushed conversations about money, no phone calls with creditors, no tension crackling through the air like electricity, just silence and the freedom that comes with it. I walked downstairs and through the rooms that were now mine alone. The furniture I'd paid for, the decorations I'd purchased, the space I'd maintained, all of it was finally just mine, without the weight of ungrateful recipients or hidden agendas. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the table where Rebecca had whispered her cruelty just 2 nights ago. The memory no longer stung. If anything, I was grateful to her for finally speaking the truth that allowed me to see clearly. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was David. George, how are you feeling? Free, I said without hesitation. For the first time in years, I feel completely free. Any regrets about how you handled it? I thought about that for a moment. No. They made their choices based on greed and deception. I simply allowed them to experience the natural consequences of those choices. What are your plans now? I'm going to live my life for myself, I said. I'm going to travel, maybe volunteer somewhere meaningful, pursue interests I've been putting off. I'm going to remember what it feels like to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. That sounds like a good plan. And if they try to contact you, they won't, I said confidently. At least not until they've exhausted all other options. And by then, I'll have built a life they can't disrupt. After I hung up, I walked out to my back patio and sat in the chair where I used to watch sunsets while worrying about Michael and Rebecca's finances. Tonight there was no worry. No anxiety about bills or relationships or hidden agendas. Just the peaceful silence of a man who had finally chosen himself. 3 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in Tuscany, reading a book I'd wanted to read for years, when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. "Dad, this is Michael. I wanted you to know that Rebecca and I are separated. We're getting divorced. I've realized a lot of things about myself and about our marriage that I should have seen earlier. I'm living in a small apartment and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. It's hard, but I'm learning to be responsible for my own life for the first time. I don't expect you to respond to this, and I'm not asking for help. I just wanted you to know that I'm finally understanding what you tried to teach me. I hope you're happy and at peace. I love you." I read the message twice, then set my phone down and returned to my book. The message didn't change anything. Too much damage had been done for a simple text to repair. But it suggested that maybe, someday, there might be room for a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. But that was a possibility for the future. Today, I was exactly where I wanted to be, free, independent, and finally living for myself. The sun was setting over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. I raised my wine glass in a small toast to the man I had become, someone who had learned that being alone with dignity was infinitely better than being surrounded by people who saw him only as a means to an end. For the first time in years, I was home, even though I was thousands of miles away from the house where I'd been betrayed. Home wasn't a place anymore. It was the peace that came with knowing my own worth and refusing to accept anything less from others. I had paid dearly for that lesson, but it was worth every penny I'd lost and every relationship I'd sacrificed to learn it. Some prices are worth paying, and freedom from those who would exploit your love is the most valuable purchase of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.